Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Please, could you take your seats? We would like to start quickly. Please take your seats. Good morning, delegates. Please take your seats. We would like to start. So, if everybody goes to their seats, and we can start as soon as possible, please. Good morning, everybody. I would like to start the meeting now and ask for some more, that people stop speaking and get to their seat. And I would like to welcome everybody. Savadi, also on behalf of my co-chair. I would like to welcome all the parties, colleagues, friends, and Director Tsering of the UNEP Regional Office sitting next to me, and all the people who will assist us the coming days. We already had a good, quick start yesterday with the workshop. I think it was very good and well organized, and it's also a very good way to get over your jet lag. So I hope everybody is very, very fresh today, and that we can really speed up all the talks and negotiations. It's always good to be here in Bangkok. The first, second, third home, I don't know, because Montreal is also our home of the Ozone family. And it's always nice to be back in this lovely country. I've been there many times, and I started a long, long time ago as a backpacker to come here when I was a student. And I admire this country for its good food, interesting culture, nature and countryside, and have a lot of good memories on it. and also of Thai families inviting me for festivities at their home. That was really a great experience, and it's also nice to see that that atmosphere is still here. So that didn't change. Looking ahead this week, we have a busy and challenging agenda ahead with both MOP decisions and COP decisions to be concluded. And just to highlight a bit on, let's say, the challenges we have, some of the decisions are clearly related to the MOP, but to become operative, they also have to be very clear decisions under the COP. So they are closely related, especially on atmospheric monitoring. And I think it's important to deal with this in a coherent way. We will do that as co-chairs, and I hope you can do that as well. And that we will deal with it in a very, let's see, logical way, and avoid a Gordian knot. And you know what happens with a Gordian knot? It's difficult to untie it, but at least if there is one, we try to untie it as quickly as possible. We all look forward to a very fruitful meeting in a good and relaxed atmosphere, and I wish you all and wish us all good luck in the coming days. Then I also would like to express our appreciation to the government and the people of Thailand for the warm welcome. And today we also have the pleasure of the company of Ms. Deshin Tsering, who is Director of UNEP's Regional Office of Asia and the Pacific. And we are very happy that she is here, but because we also understood she is acting as Director at interim on the Climate Change Division and was based in Nairobi for a couple of months. So happy to be here, and please, yeah, you can give your statement.
Distinguished co-chairs, Ms. Miruza Mohammed of the Maldives and Mr. Ralph Briscone of the Netherlands, esteemed Executive Secretary of the Ozone Secretariat, Ms. Megumi Seki, esteemed delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a very warm welcome to Bangkok. I'm very pleased to address you today on behalf of the United Nations Environment Programme at the combined 13 Conference of Parties to the Vienna Convention and the 36th meeting of the parties to the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol is a symbol of unity. Nations across the globe have harmonized their efforts to phase out ozone-depleting substances, safeguarding the delicate shield that protects life on Earth. The Montreal Protocol is more than just a guardian of the ozone layer. For us, it's a pioneer in the fight against climate change. And through the Kigali Amendment, we're reducing hydrofluorocarbons that mitigate global warming and preserve ecosystems. By recovering the ozone layer, we both shield life from harmful UV radiation, we contribute to the recovery of nature. The return to safe UVB levels help protect ecosystems and biodiversity. Furthermore, the reduction of UVB radiation leads to a decrease in ground-level ozone production. It improves air quality and benefits human health. The phasing out of chlorofluorocarbons, hydrochlorofluorocarbons, and now the phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, potent greenhouse gases contribute significantly to the mitigation of climate change. Last week, UNEP released the latest emission gap report. The findings of the report show that we have much ground to make up. To get on a least cost pathway for 1.5 degrees, we have to reduce emissions 42% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. For 2 degrees, we have to reduce emissions by 28% by 2030. The Kigali Amendment alone has the potential to avoid 0.5 degrees centigrade of global warming by the end of the century. Moreover, the gradual reduction of HFCs by 2047 has the potential to avoid release of up to 105 million tons of greenhouse gases measured in carbon dioxide equivalent. So I encourage all parties who have not yet done so to join the 160 nations who have ratified this crucial amendment. We stand at a pivotal moment. Annex 5 parties are navigating the complex transitions from HCFCs and HFCs to alternatives that have low global warming potential, a journey that will demand unwavering commitment, technological innovation, and financial support. We in UNEP, we are a steadfast companion on this journey. We offer our expertise and resources to ensure a smooth and sustainable transition for all. Access to cooling should not be a luxury. Cooling services are essential to protect population and economy from escalating temperatures, as well as preserving food and medicine. Emissions from cooling are predicted to increase between 4.4 to 6.1 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2050, and this will account for about 10% of global projected emissions in 2050. The good news is that cooling action offers a triple win. We can mitigate climate change, we can enhance lives, and we can generate economic productivity. I urge all parties to reinforce the national legislation and policy frameworks related to Montreal Protocol to promote the adoption of ozone and climate-friendly technologies, including the consideration of energy efficiency while phasing down HCFCs and phasing down HFCs. A number of parties have already taken the opportunity to integrate national cooling action plans as part of your nationally determined contributions, which will set the sustainable way forward to mitigate climate change. I encourage parties who have not yet done so to work with their respective climate change officers to develop a national cooling action plan and to further integrate it into the nationally determined contributions. We are looking at the next generation of nationally determined contributions, NDCs 3.0, to look at non-CO2 gases too. We've seen strong momentum on cooling. The UNEP-convened Cool Coalition launched the Global Cooling Pledge at the UNFCCC 28th Conference of Parties in Dubai. This pledge raises ambition for countries to work to reduce global warming-related emissions by 68% by 2050, improve energy efficiency of cooling technologies by 50% by 2050, and to increase access to sustainable cooling for the most vulnerable. UNEP, through initiatives like Cool Coalition, we're dedicated to promoting best practices and fostering a global culture of refrigerant stewardship. This stewardship is particularly vital in the refrigeration and air conditioning sector. I would like to congratulate the Ozone Secretariat for their successful organization of the Life Cycle Refrigerant Management Workshop, which demonstrates that Montreal Protocol has an important role not only in the phase-out or phase-down of controlled substances and energy efficiency, but also sustained management of refrigerants in a holistic manner. I hope you will take a moment to celebrate the milestones we have achieved. The Montreal Protocol has phased out over 90% of ozone-depleting substances, prevented the significant release of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. This is a testament to the power of ingenuity and cooperation. So I hope we can combine a collective commitment and determination to ensure that COP13 to the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer and the 36th meeting of the parties to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer are a success. I wish you all fruitful and inspiring discussions in the days ahead, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Ms. Chering, for your warm welcome and nice words. And I now would like to invite Meg to give her statement for opening of the OEWT.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Good morning, everyone. Distinguished co-chairs, Regional Director of UNEP's Asia and the Pacific Office, representatives of the parties to the Montreal Protocol, members of the assessment panels, representatives of the UN and other international organizations, colleagues from the Fund Secretariat and implementing agencies, representatives of non-governmental organizations and industry, ozone stakeholders, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Bangkok for the combined 13th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Vienna Convention and the 36th meeting of the parties to the Montreal Protocol. While our meeting is faced with a very packed agenda, your hard work during the OEWG held in Montreal in July, several draft decisions were forwarded for final discussions and possible adoption by this MOP. The ozone research managers also met in April this year and have provided their recommendations on issues related to research and monitoring for consideration by the COP. We also know that our 3 assessment panels and the advisory committee of the General Trust Fund of the Vienna Convention have been working hard in the run up to this meeting, and we will hear the presentations on their work. We also look forward to the presentation of the chair of the executive committee on the work carried out under the Multilateral Fund since the last MOP. This presentation is going to happen during the high-level segment. The 73rd meeting of the Implementation Committee and the joint meeting of the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol Bureau also took place a couple of days ago in Bangkok. The IMCOM president will report on the committee's work and the draft decisions that are being recommended for MOP to consider for adoption. On behalf of the parties and the Ozone Secretariat, I would like to express how proud we are of our outstanding subsidiary bodies of the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol, and for their incredible work. The parties themselves have also been working hard throughout the year and intersessionally. With your usual diligence, dedication, and determination, I am sure that all this work will bear fruit in the next 5 days and even beyond. All the preparatory work for this COP and MOP culminated ended in a high note with this workshop on LRM yesterday. I believe that the workshop actually gave very good insights into the issue of LRM, and there was some very good interactive discussions on various issues. And I would like to really thank the facilitators, presenters, and experts who provided their knowledge and experiences, and to all the participants for their active interventions and questions that demonstrated great interest. We will be issuing a summary that collates the key messages from the workshop, including from the Mentimeter, which seemed to have worked really well, I'm glad to say. So the summary document will be hopefully issued very soon, ready for your consideration during this preparatory segment. So I hope that the workshop outcomes is going to be helping you, the parties, to develop concrete actions going forward. Distinguished delegates, in this growing planetary crisis of climate change, the United Nations Secretary General, in his call to action to beat rising global temperature, said, "Extreme heat is having an extreme impact on people and planet. The world must rise to the challenge of rising temperatures." The Montreal Protocol and its Kigali Amendment provide hope. The Montreal Protocol has already made a massive contribution to combat climate change by phasing out ODSs. Phasing down HFCs under the Kigali Amendment and making cooling technology more efficient and sustainable will create an additional big climate benefit that can keep the planet cooler. By implementing effective LRM measures, we can also cut about 39 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions of HFCs and HCFCs in the cooling sector in the next 25 years. This is according to the report by the TEEP on LRM, which was presented in July to the parties. And this figure is roughly equivalent to a whole year's worth of global CO2 emissions under current levels. But then these gains will be mere projections if we do not act. As beautifully put, as one of the key messages from the workshop, let me see if I get this right. Now, it is better to do the best we can than to look back and regret not having done what we could have done. I think maybe the wording is a little bit not as beautiful as it was put in the workshop, but I think this is a very strong key message. Distinguished delegates, soon we will be commemorating 3 back-to-back anniversaries, starting with the 40th anniversary of the Vienna Convention next year, followed by the 10th anniversary of the Kigali Amendment in 2026, and the 40th anniversary of the Montreal Protocol in 2027. All 3 milestones are opportunities for us to highlight the tremendous achievements of the ozone treaties and what can still be achieved. To reap the full benefits of the Kigali Amendment, its universal ratification is needed. I would like to propose that we try to achieve this universal ratification by the time of the 10th anniversary of the Kigali Amendment in 2026. 38 parties are yet to ratify, but we can work together to try to achieve this concrete target. Yes, so this was a very important point that I wanted to make. So let us all work together and try to get the 38 countries to ratify the Kigali Amendment, and we are here to assist as much as possible to achieve this concrete target. So as a final point, I wanted to quickly mention that there will be a side event on the joint UNEP, CCAC, and FAO report on N2O. Parties may recall that the Scientific Assessment Panel had noted in its 2022 quadrennial assessment that N2O continues to grow in the atmosphere at rates exceeding some of the highest projections, that almost half of the N2O emissions in recent years are of anthropogenic origin. The report will provide you with concrete assessment of the latest information on N2O. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and may I wish you fruitful and productive discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meg, for these kind words and also putting us into action for this meeting, and that we have some good decisions on Friday evening at the MOP COP. Um, Let me now turn over to my co-chair for the next agenda item. Please, Mirosa.
Thank you, Ralph. On agenda item 2, which deals with organizational matters. We will start with agenda item 2A on the adoption of the agenda. As indicated in the notification sent out by the Secretariat on 15th October 2024, the State of Palestine has requested the postponement of consideration of sub-item 4O to MOP 37. As also indicated in that notification, my co-chair and I would suggest that we delete this item from the provisional agenda of this meeting and include it on the provisional agenda for the 47th meeting of the OEWG. I hope that this proposal is acceptable to the parties. Thank you. I would like to see now if delegates wish to make any other changes or add items to the provisional agenda. If delegates have specific issues that they would like to discuss under agenda item 6 on other matters, I request that they raise them now. I open the floor for any comments and suggestions. On my list, I have Egypt and Switzerland. Egypt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair, and good morning, everyone. As this first time to take the floor, we would like this delegation to thank the people and the government of Thailand for hosting our meeting in this beautiful city, Bangkok. We also would like to thank the Secretariat for organizing and facilitating our meeting. And actually, I would like to add to the agenda item, review the decision 28/2 bara 17, which states that the cutoff date for eligible capacity is 1st January 2020 for those parties with baseline year from 20 to 22 and 1st January 24 for those parties with baseline years from 24 to 26. And I thank you.
Thank you, Egypt. Now I give the floor to Switzerland.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Good morning, colleagues. Since this is the first time this delegation takes the floor, we would like to take the opportunity to thank the Secretariat for such a good preparation of the meeting, but also the assessment panels for their hard and important work, our dedicated co-chair for their dedication to our common objectives, and of course the people of Thailand for their friendly welcome here in Bangkok. Switzerland would like to request an addition to item 6 other matter that refers to isomer of HFC not explicitly listed in Annex F of the Montreal Protocol. This issue has been brought to the attention of the parties by the Secretariat's information document INF6, which was posted about 10 days ago and which is based on very recent information that was made available to the Secretariat. Since not all parties may have had the opportunity to look at this information document, we would like to briefly summarize now the essential points from the document. And I will be very brief I promise. So an isomer of HFC 245, which is not explicitly listed in Annex F, but still falls under the definition of controlled substances under the Montreal Protocol, has recently become commercially relevant. However, no GWP value has been agreed for the sake of reporting under the Montreal Protocol, and current references indicate a significant GWP value above 4,000. The Secretariat has included in the information document some possible ways forward and how parties could deal with this matter. We would like to thank the Secretariat for making this information available to the parties. We think this topic is of high relevance to the parties of the Montreal Protocol, and therefore we would welcome if time was made available within the agenda of this meeting to allow the Secretariat to give further explanation on this issue and give parties the opportunity to reflect on it and start the deliberation on it if they wish to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other items to add under other matters? Thank you. With this, I would like to ask the delegates if the meeting can agree to adopt the agenda with the issue of HFC 245CB and the change in cutoff date in decision 28.2 of MOP 28. Okay, then the agenda is adopted. I now hand over the floor over to my co-chair.
Thank you, Miruza. Here we go to Agenda 2B, the organization of work, and I have a lot of things to say, so buckle up and I try to go through the whole organization as work as quickly as possible. On the screen you can see the proposed order of our work, and it generally follows the sequence of the items as presented in the agenda of the meeting, except in a few instances where we are proposing a slight reordering of the sequence of items to ensure that we make best use of our time and to get contact groups as running as quickly as possible. We have done our best as co-chairs to estimate the time needed for the discussions of each of the agenda items, and we expect that we can go through the items that we already discussed at OEWG 46 quite quickly, because in Montreal we already agreed to continue consideration of these matters during this preparatory segment. Therefore, we already know that the contact group should be established to continue the discussion as agreed at OEWG 46. Right after we finish the organization of work, we will start with agenda item 3 on financial reports and budget of the trust fund for the convention of and the protocol, and then move through the agenda items as seen above. So it will go from 4A, consideration of the membership, emissions of HFC 23, potential changes to data reporting for HFC 23, VSLS, and feedstock. You will see all the items put on the screen. We will break for lunch from 1 till 3. And in the afternoon, we would like to address agenda items C, as on life cycle refrigerant management, which includes also the outcomes of the workshop, and then continue till item 4L, nominations of CUN for methyl bromide. Tomorrow, we will start with the remaining items of the Montreal Protocol issues, beginning with agenda item 4K on the unwanted imports of energy inefficient equipment. and then go through item 4.0, or maybe on the 4A already, the report of the ORM, which is an item under the COP. We then break for lunch again from 1 till 3, and have content groups running. Also have content groups running in, let's say, the evening of Monday. And then we would like to go through the rest of the agenda tomorrow and go through all the other matters and hope to finish early afternoon. And we also go through the AOB items that were just added to the agenda. I hope we really can get through it as quickly as possible, because that gives us the time and opportunity to schedule more contact group already tomorrow and also on Wednesday before we have the high-level segment started. Ideally, we should wrap up the preparatory segment on Wednesday, but the experience is that we may not conclude this work by Wednesday, and we'll have to meet in parallel with the high-level segment, which starts on Thursday. We try to limit the number of contact groups as much as possible, so maybe we have to combine items, or if we run out of time, we maybe have to run some groups in parallel. So please be as efficient as possible, and also look for ways to get to agreement on several of those items, and that we have, let's say, everything agreed on Friday. This is how the organization of works looks. Now I would like to go to a few housekeeping matters. We run the plenary from 10 till 1, and in the afternoon from 3 till 6. And we would like to start in time. So be in time, and the bell will be rung before the meeting starts. The meetings of the timing of the plenary meetings and groups will be announced in the screens around the venue and in the plenary hall, as well as in the meeting portal and then the mobile app. The mobile app changed its logo. It always changed for every OEWG and MOP its logo. But if you have it on your phone from last time, it changes automatically, so that's very, very convenient. So also try to use Make of That apps, and it gives access to the meeting information, daily schedule documents, and the streaming of all the plenary sessions. You also will give notifications of any changes of the schedule and urgent matters, and please, if you don't have it, try to download it. To book meeting rooms, please direct any request to Ms. Sukanya Konkiao, and the email address is indicated on the screen, and also in the meeting information page of the meeting portal. With regard to the conference room papers, please submit them in electronic form as soon as possible to Ms. Liazat Rabiosi. Her email address is also indicated on the screen and in the meeting portal. And please bear in mind we have constraints with translation. So any CRP submitted before lunchtime on Thursday would be translated into the 6 UN official languages. Translation may not be possible for any submissions made after that time, but they will be made available to the meeting in English only or in any other UN language of submission. If you need any help or information, please seek assistance from the help desk located outside of the meeting hall. And now, as part of the organization of work, we would like to go through the work that needs to be done in preparation for the high-level segment. First of all, the election of the COP13 and MOP 36 bureaus. In relation to items 2A and B of the agenda of the high-level segment on Wednesday, at the latest, we will need to know your nominations for the presidents and other members of the Bureau of the 13th meeting of the COP of the Vienna Convention and the 36th MOP of the Montreal Protocol. For COP13, as you see on the screen, following the regional rotation agreed by the parties, the president of COP13 is expected to come from the group of Asia-Pacific states. The rapporteur is expected to come from the group of African states, and the vice presidents are expected to come from the groups of Eastern European states, Latin American and Caribbean states, and Western European and other states. For MOP 36, you can see from the screen, following the regional rotation agreed by the parties, the president of MOP 36 is expected to come from the group of Latin American and Caribbean states. The rapporteur is expected to come from the group of Eastern European states, and the vice presidents are expected to come from the groups of African states, Asia-Pacific states, and Western European and other states. Then the membership of the Montreal Protocol bodies for 2025. In addition, we will have to be prepared to forward to the high level segment a group of final decisions covering membership for the 2025 Montreal Protocol bodies. We will discuss this matter under agenda item 4A. We urge you to meet early in your groups and provide your nominations for the Bureau as well as your nominations and selections for the positions in the Montreal Protocol bodies, and send the names to Mr. Pablo Moscoso of the Ozone Secretariat as soon as possible, and on Wednesday at the latest. Pablo's email address is on the slide and in the meeting portal, and as the Secretariat receives the nominations, they will be posted in the meeting portal under the meeting information page. Then I would like to move to the statements by the heads of delegations and credentials. Item 5 of the provisional agenda for the high-level segment on statements by the head of delegations should start on Thursday afternoon. The time limit for each statement is 5 minutes maximum. If the head of your delegation wishes to speak, we would ask that you submit your request to the help desk located outside the plenary hall. The Ozone Secretariat will keep a list of those requests. Submission of any written statements to the Secretary by Wednesday will also help facilitate good interpretation by the interpreters. For any submission to be made by email, please use the email address of Ms. Jacqueline Nyanyu as indicated on the screens and the meeting portal. Please also submit the credentials of your delegation at the help desk as soon as possible and by the end of the Thursday afternoon plenary session at the very latest. The credentials will be reviewed by the new bureaus of COP13 and MOP 36 on Friday morning. Before we move to agree on the organization of work, I was asked by the Secretary to announce there will be a reception on Thursday, and it will be in the reception hall on the ground floor. And the Secretariat is inviting all the participants. There will be reminders on this at a later stage. I would now like to make sure the organization of work we have laid out is acceptable to the meeting, and are there any questions or comments? I don't see any questions or comments, so the organization of work is agreed. Then I would like to hand over the floor to Mirosa.
Thank you. Now we move to agenda item 3 on financial reports and budgets of the trust funds for the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol. Parties will recall that we review and adopt decisions on the budget for the Vienna Convention every 3 years, while we review and adopt decisions on the budget of the Montreal Protocol each year. The financial reports of the trust funds for both are reviewed every year. In keeping with our practice, we would like to establish a budget committee to review the proposed budgets and the financial reports and prepare draft decisions for the consideration of the parties. The documents containing the information required for the discussion are indicated on the screen. These documents were posted in the meeting portal 3 months before this meeting for parties to review. We requested Sebastian from Germany to chair the budget committee, and he has very kindly agreed to do so. Interested parties, please join the committee. I would like to ask the committee to start its work with its first meeting at 1:45 p.m. today in the Asia Pacific foyer on the ground floor. We would like to allocate the same space for the committee to meet every day of the week as necessary. Thank you. Before we move to the next agenda item, I note that decisions under item 4F on enhancing the global and regional atmospheric monitoring of substances controlled by the Montreal Protocol, and item 5B on the status of the General Trust Fund for financing activities on research and systematic observations relevant to the Vienna Convention may have impacts on the budget discussions. The Secretariat and the parties can try to ensure that the Budget Committee is informed on the developments in the discussions of those relevant agenda items. With this, we move to agenda item 4A, consideration of the membership of Montreal Protocol bodies for 2025. MOP 36 needs to decide on the membership of the Implementation Committee and the co-chairs of the OEWG for 2025, and to endorse the selection of the new members of the Executive Committee of the Multilateral Fund. The screen also shows the positions that need to be decided on. And if you have not done the consultations in your groups, maybe it's too early, we urge you to initiate consultations in your groups and provide your nominations for the Montreal Protocol bodies and send the names to Mr. Pablo of the Ozone Secretariat as soon as possible and on Wednesday at the latest. His email address is also indicated on the screen. The placeholder decisions for the membership of the Implementation Committee, the Executive Committee, and the co-chairs of the OEWG are contained in the draft decisions document. The document 36/3 as draft decisions 36BB, 36CC, and GD respectively. The blanks in the placeholders decisions will be filled in by the Secretariat as nominations are received, and the draft decisions will be forwarded to the high-level segment for adoption. To facilitate and increase the transparency of the nomination, selection, or election processes, the Secretariat will be posting the nominations for the various positions in these bodies on the COP13 MOP 36 portal and will be announcing updates on a regular basis during the meeting. Thank you, and with this, I now hand over to my co-chair to deal with the next agenda item.
Thank you, and I also already would like to ask Sab and Teep to come here for the presentations they will give. So please, if you come forward. We now go to agenda item 4B, HFC 23. We will first consider sub-item 4B 1 on the reports of the SAP and the TEEP on HFC 23 emissions. In decision 35/7 on emissions of HFC 23, SAP and TEEP requested to provide further information on this. Specifically, SAP was requested to provide an update on emissions and concentrations of HFC 23 to supplement the quadrennial report of 2022, and TEEP was requested to provide information regarding the quantity of HFC 23 being consumed by country, sector, and updated estimates of the amount of HFC 23 generated at the end of emissions from HCFC 22 production facilities. In the same decision, parties were available with available relevant scientific or technical information that might help inform the reports of the panels were invited to provide that information to the Secretariat by the 1st of March 2024. The Secretariat did not receive information from parties. In response to the parties' request, SAP and TEEP coordinated and produced individual reports. A summary of the reports can be found in the addendum to the Secretariat's note for this meeting, and the full reports are available on the meeting portal. And the exact references can be seen on the screen. Now I would like to give the floor to SAP and TEEP. And please keep your presentations within 15 minutes. So I don't know who will take the floor first, but that's up to you, but at least 2 times 15 minutes. Please. And afterwards, we will have a combined Q&A and a discussion. So that's something I would like to say already. After the presentations, we have a combined Q&A session and a discussion as well.
Welcome. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the report of the Scientific Assessment Panel in response to Decision 35/7 on emissions of 23. I'm here to present on behalf of my co-author and other co-authors, the SAP co-chairs. And I would like to recognize the contributions and assistance of the TEEP, the Multilateral Fund and the Ozone Secretariat, and in particular, other important contributors such as the A-Gauge community of scientists. This report is mostly an update to what was provided in the previous ozone assessment. And so you will see an emphasis on the most recent years. First slide, getting right to it, talking about the atmospheric abundance in the remote atmosphere and how that's changed over time. You can see that the atmospheric abundance has increased throughout the entire record. From 2019 to 2022, the global mean abundance increased at a rate that was slightly over 1 part per trillion per year. This rate of increase in the recent years was about 6% slower than it had been in the previous 5 years, which were the years most recently assessed in the previous assessment. The abundance in 2022 was 35.9 parts per trillion, which accounts for about 6.9 milliwatts per meter squared of radiative forcing, or about 15% of total radiative forcing from all HFCs. Recall that HFC 23 has a lifetime of 228 years. That's over 4 times longer than CFC 11, with an implication being that in the absence of emission, the concentration of this chemical would decline at less than 0.5% per year in the atmosphere. An emission today will influence the abundance of this chemical in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And the global warming potential is larger than either CFC-11 or CFC-12. Next, this slide focuses on HFC-23 global emissions as derived from atmospheric abundances. Overall, you can see since 1990, those emissions have approximately more than doubled. But in the most recent years, the emissions have declined from their peak in 2019 at 17.3 kilotons to 13.9 in 2022. This decrease in emission during those last years was observed despite an increase in total production and reported total production of HCFC-22 and generation of HFC-23 during those years. The decline in global emissions, while HCFC-22 production was increasing, may reflect improved mitigation of 23, as an increasing number of parties ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. We now compare the emissions derived from global atmospheric abundances to reported values for expectations that are based on reporting of emissions to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Multilateral Fund and the Ozone Secretariat. So this figure shows the atmospheric-derived emissions in blue compared to the reporting-based expectations in red. From 1995 to 2014, good consistency was observed between estimated and reported-based global emissions of 23. And this was even the case from 2005 to 2014 when reported HFC-23 destruction, which was mostly in China, and supported by the UNFCCC's Clean Development Mechanism, peaked at a destruction that accounted for nearly 9 kilotons per year. After 2014, a difference or gap emerged between estimated and reporting-based global emissions. This gap grew to reach a peak of 15 kilotons in 2019, and it has decreased in the 3 years since 2019 to reach a value of approximately 10.5 to 12.5 kilotons in 2022. The Technology and Economic Assessment Panel has estimated 23 emissions from all known sources and reported abatements after 2020. You'll hear about that in the presentation subsequent to this one I'm giving. And the magnitude of all known industrial-based sources after 2020 appears to be in the range of approximately 1.5 to 3.5 kilotons per year, which is substantially smaller than the atmospherically derived mean emission of 15 kilotons per year during 2020 to 2022. In this SAP report, we also estimate the HFC-23 source from atmospheric photochemistry, as HFC-23 can be produced in the atmosphere from reactions that oxidize certain fluorinated gases, not all of them, but certain ones present in the atmosphere. An upper limit to this source was estimated to be about 0.43 kilotons per year, which accounts for less than 3% of the global HFC-23 emissions in that year. This estimate is an upper limit. The actual value could be substantially smaller. And this source was estimated using measured atmospheric abundances of the relevant fluorinated gases and available kinetic information. On the right side of this figure is a list of the chemicals that we anticipate or could contribute or do contribute to the formation of HFC-23 in the atmosphere. They include a range of HFCs, HCFCs, and HFOs, and an HCFO. Contributing gases have a particular chemical structure that's indicated in the lower right there. This figure shows now as a black line the difference between the globally derived emissions and the global expectations in emissions over time, or the gap, the emission gap, and how it's evolved over time. And you can see that that gap was fairly small between 2000 and 2015. But the gap increased substantially between 2015 and 2018. And that increase between 2015 and 18 is similar in magnitude and coincident in time with the destroyed amounts of HFC 23 reported by China to the Multilateral Fund. And these amounts are consistent with the country's HPPNP agreement with the Multilateral Fund Executive Committee. This behavior is different than was observed during the CDM-related abatements after 2005, between 2005 and 2015, which were abatements applied related to destruction that occurred mostly in China. And you can see that there was large abatements during that year, but no increase in the gap during those years. So apparently good agreement in expectation versus what was estimated for emissions globally during those years. Now the decrease in this gap after 2020 is concurrent with a declining ratio in global HFC 23 emissions relative to total HCFC 22 production. That emission of 23 relative to the production of 22 ratio. And you can see that substantial decline in that ratio overall, but in particular after 2020 in this figure highlighted by that black circle. And that large decrease in those last few years suggests an increase in the inferred overall abatement of HFC 23 emissions. This figure includes two lines. The blue line is the emission over production ratio using atmospheric-based emissions, whereas the red line is using HFC 23 emissions based on reporting. So that expected emission to production ratio was meant to be, or was substantially lower than actually is implied by the atmospheric emissions on a global scale. We have new information or additional information on emissions derived from the atmosphere on a regional basis. New atmospheric measurements have refined the quantification of 23 emissions in some geographic regions. The sum of available regional emission estimates is less than the global total derived from atmospheric abundances in the remote atmosphere, indicating that not all regional sources have been included to date in that atmospheric observational system. Indeed, all the atmospheric-based estimates are not available for all parties who are producing and reported production of HCFC 22 in recent years. Estimates are available in and around, based on atmospheric abundances measured at stations in and around China, from the United Kingdom, Western Japan, Korea, the Netherlands, and other portions of Europe. If we focus first on China, the figure here shows atmospheric-derived estimates of emission versus the reporting-based estimates of emission. The atmospheric-derived values are in blue, the reporting-based are in red. From 2015 to 2019, regional HFC 23 emission estimates were derived for eastern China from atmospheric abundances measured at the Gosan station. These emissions from eastern China increased during these years from 5.7 to 9.5 kilotons of HFC 23 per year, despite reporting provided to MLF showing that by 2018, more than 95% of the HFC 23 generated in China had been destroyed, stored, or used as feedstock. The derived geographical distribution of regional sources from the atmospheric measurements is broadly consistent with known locations of fluorochemical production facilities in China, including those producing HCFC 22. Since 2020, additional HFC 23 measurements have been made at multiple sites in China, and they suggest continued emissions of HFC 23 during 2020 to the years 2020 to 2023 in amounts from two different regions of 3.2 and 6.7 kilotons per year. And these emission estimates for eastern China or for northern China are substantially larger than A7 emissions for controlled processes reported for all of China to the Ozone Secretariat. Based on these studies, unreported emissions from portions of China account for approximately 20 to 50% of the global emission gap during 2016 to 2022. From other locations, there also have been new estimates of emissions on a regional basis. They include a number of additional countries. Summed emissions in recent years from these other countries totals 3/4 of a kiloton, which is 4/10 higher than their reporting to the UNFCCC, for example, but not enough to explain a significant portion of the global emission gap. All of the regions whose emissions of HFC 23 that are covered by the available atmospheric measurements, they account for 85% of the reported total production of HCFC 22. And atmospherically derived emissions of HFC 23 are not available in recent years for countries that account for nearly all the remaining HCFC 22 production reported, and those countries include India, the United States, and the Russian Federation. So in summary, a substantial shortfall remains in the attribution of global emissions of HFC 23 to known sources or regions, despite the new information available in this supplemental report. The gap is not reconciled by considering all known sources. And the sum of updated estimates of previously unrecognized or unaccounted sources as provided by TEEP and the estimated production from atmospheric oxidation could reduce the emission gap by as much as 3 kilotons per year. Regional studies conclude that emissions in recent years from regions of China are substantially larger than expected from China as a whole, and Chinese emissions from those different regions can account for a substantial fraction of the global emission gap, even during 2021 and 2022. These emissions have not been reported or considered previously in a quantitative assessment of the global gap. In contrast, the total of regional emissions from 11 other countries in recent years are small relative to the gap. And a regional scale accounting of global emissions remains incomplete, as atmospheric-based estimates are not available from some regions of the world that are potentially significant sources of HFC 23 emission. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Steve. Now, on behalf of the TEEP and its Medical and Chemicals Technical Options Committee and my co-chairs, Takashi Eriguchi and Junjun Zhang, it's my pleasure to present to you TEEP's response to Decision 35.7 on emissions of HFC 23. Here's the decision, and paragraph 2 of that decision requested TEEP to report to this meeting on the quantity of HFC 23 being consumed by country and by sector, and on updated estimates on the amounts of HFC 23 generated at and emissions from HCFC 22 production facilities. Paragraph 1 of the decision requested the Science Assessment Panel to report, as has just been presented. And paragraph 5 of the decision invited parties to provide information to the panels that may help inform the reports. No such information was provided. This TEEP report updates information in the 2022 MCTOC assessment report and the 2023 TEEP response to decision 34.7 strengthening institutional processes with respect to information on HFC 23 byproduct emissions. Firstly, how we went about preparing our report. The Medical and Chemicals Technical Options Committee led preparation of the report on behalf of the TEEP, and the MCTOC and SAP collaborated closely in preparation of their comprehensive reports and conclusions that support further consideration by parties. For paragraph 2A, MCTOC consulted TEEP experts to address HFC 23 consumption from other relevant sectors. And for paragraph 2B, MCTOC estimated or documented amounts of HFC 23 generated and emitted from HCFC 22 production facilities, including from Article 7 data reporting. For additional context, consistent with previous reports, updated information is provided on other HFC 23 emissions from consumptive and emissive uses of HFC 23, including as byproduct from the production of other Annex C Group 1 and Annex F substances. Some background first to the generation of HFC 23 byproduct. There are several chemical mechanisms that can generate HFC 23 as a byproduct in chemical production processes, including the over or under reaction of chemicals present in the reaction vessel en route to the intended product, the presence of impurities in the feedstocks that are being reacted, such as the chloroform impurity in dichloromethane feedstock that's used to produce HFC 32, and unintended side reactions where the feedstock follows a different reaction path to the one that is desired to make the product. The generation of HFC 23 as a byproduct during HCFC 22 production is far greater than the amount of HFC 23 required for use as feedstock or for consumption. Parties to the Kigali Amendment, in which HCFC 22 is produced, are required to destroy HFC 23 to the extent practicable using a destruction technology, for example, incineration, approved by the Montreal Protocol. Operation and maintenance of incineration facilities to destroy HFC 23 byproduct is a cost to the companies responsible for its generation, particularly as HCFC 22 is a low profit margin product. In response to paragraph 2A of the decision regarding the quantity of HFC 23 being consumed by country and by sector, information on consumption is not always readily available to the level of detail requested in the decision, that is by country and by sector. HFC 23 consumption and feedstock use data are not available for all parties due to the timing of reporting obligations associated with ratification of the Kigali Amendment. Some data are available from other sources relating to the quantities used for each of the applications. HFC 23 is consumed as a feedstock and also in very small quantities in emissive uses for fire suppression, very low temperature refrigeration, and semiconductor and electronics manufacturing. Several parties that manufacture Annex C Group 1 and Annex F substances capture the HFC 23 that is generated for feedstock and or emissive uses, or divert it for destruction. Alternatively, parties produce HFC 23 separately for feedstock and or emissive uses. Reported HFC 23 consumption was about 3,700 tonnes in 2022, with about 2,600 tonnes of that for non-feedstock uses, and that's based on Article 7 and published data by the US EPA, and about 1,100 tonnes for feedstock use based on Article 7 data for 2022. For fire protection, small consumption of HFC 23, there's small consumption of HFC 23 compared to HFC 227EA used in fire protection. For RAC HP, there's very small consumption of HFC 23 in ultra-low temperature refrigeration. And for etchant and chamber cleaning in semiconductor and electronics manufacturing, the average annual growth rate of HFC 23 consumption has been approximately 15%, with global consumption of 277 tonnes in 2013, increasing to around 720 tonnes in 2020. In response to paragraph 2B of the decision regarding updated estimates on quantities of HFC 23 generated at and emissions from 22 production facilities, the methodology and information used by MCTOC was Article 7 data on quantities of HCFC 22 production and HFC 23 emissions, which are reported by parties under mandatory obligations. The timing of obligations impacts the completeness of the HFC 23 emissions data, which was supplemented with reported UNFCCC data for the United States. Data on quantities of HFC 23 generated from HCFC 22 production are reported by parties on a voluntary basis and are not published by parties in this report. HFC 23 generation data are not reported by all parties known to produce HCFC 22. So MCTOC applied estimated HFC 23 byproduct generation rates to the Article 7 data reported on HCFC 22 production quantities to estimate HFC 23 byproduct generation quantities. For 2022, total HCFC production reported under Article 7 was around 1,200,000 tonnes. Estimated HFC 23 byproduct generation from HCFC 22 production is in the range of about 18,000 to 36,000 tonnes, and this is consistent with the HFC 23 generation data reported by parties on a voluntary basis. Total HFC 23 emissions from HCFC 22 production reported under Article 7 and UNFCCC for the United States was about 836 tonnes. For additional context, updated TEEP estimates of global HFC 23 emissions from all known emission sources are provided, including from facilities that manufacture Annex C Group 1 or Annex F substances and emissive uses, as previously presented in the September 2023 TEEP report in response to Decision 34.7. Current best estimates of HFC 23 emissions are based on known sources and updated available information, including in the report and from the September 2023 report. Some of these are broad estimates where further information to improve their accuracy is currently not available to the TEEP. TEEP estimates HFC 23 emissions from known emission sources at about 1,500 to 3,500 tonnes per year in recent years. This excludes the SAP estimate of the potential additional source of HFC 23 from atmospheric oxidation, which, as we've heard, is less than 430 tonnes per year in recent years. As a comparison, under the UNFCCC's Category 2 industrial processes and product use for net HFC 23 emissions and removals. Total reported HFC 23 emissions for Annex 1 parties only were around 1,400 tonnes for 2021. In comparison, based on atmospheric observations, SAP reports estimated global HFC 23 emissions of about 1,300, the noise in the background was a bit distracting. 1,300, 900, plus or minus 700 tonnes for 2022. To summarise some of the conclusions, there are large differences between TEEP and SAP estimates of global HFC 23 emissions. And I'll try and get these numbers right now. 1,470 to, which is 1,470 to 3,540 tonnes compared to 13,900 plus or minus 700 tonnes. Uncertainties in atmospheric derived estimates cannot explain the difference between SAP and TEEP estimates. Differences between TEEP and SAP estimates cannot currently be explained with the data reported under Article 7 and other sources. TEEP has identified all the major sources likely to contribute most of the HFC 23 emissions, and these are outlined in the report. In this context, it's worth remembering that in terms of the more significant HFC 23 sources, around 95% of estimated total global HFC 23 byproduct generation is from HCFC 22 production. So a major portion of TEEP's estimate of total HFC 23 emissions comes from data reported under Article 7 and UNFCCC for HFC 23 emissions, which is predominantly from HCFC 22 production. For known sources other than HCFC 22 production, uncertainties in TEEP estimates of HFC 23 emissions from these relatively smaller emission sources are unlikely to bridge the difference between TEEP and SAP estimates. Any unknown smaller sources that we haven't accounted for are unlikely to bridge the large difference between TEEP and SAP estimates. There are unknowns and uncertainties surrounding the Article 7 data reporting for HFC 23 emissions, including how facilities are measuring and reporting those emissions. Given the large difference between TEEP and SAP estimates, the question arises whether data is accurate and/or have been combined from all the sources required under Article 7. Consideration of approaches used by parties when measuring and reporting HFC 23 emissions might address some of the current unknowns and uncertainties. Refinements to Data Form 6 might help address some of these issues, and parties may wish to consider refinements to the reporting of HFC 23 emissions. And with that, I conclude the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, TEEP and SAP, for this presentation and also for giving more information to the parties on your report. Now I would like to open the floor for questions and answers and discussion together. So please indicate if you would like to speak and push the button. And please push the button in front of you because it corresponds to the name of the party, and I think that's important to get the right parties to speak. I have requests now from Romania and Tunisia, but I'm not sure if they are. Is Romania asking for the floor? No, it's not. So it's Tunisia, India, and the Russian Federation. Please, in that order, Tunisia first.
شكرا السيد المشارك. في البداية أتقدم بجزيل الشكر إلى أمانة الأوزون على حسن تنظيم هذا الاجتماع، وكذلك إلى حكومة تايلاندا على حسن الاستقبال. والشكر كذلك موصول إلى فريق التقييم العلمي ساب وفريق التقييم التكنولوجي والاقتصادي تياب للمجهودات القيمة فيما يخص إعداد هذين التقريرين وفيما يخص خاصة انبعاثات مادة HFC 23 في الغلاف الجوي. سؤالي هو يتمحور حول تقديرات التي تم التطرق إليها فيما يتعلق بنسبة تركيز HFC 23 في الغلاف الجوي. تقديرات فريق تياب أقل بكثير من تقديرات فريق التقييم العلمي ساب. وكذلك تمت الإشارة في التقرير أن نسبة تركيز مادة HCFC 22 ارتفعت في الغلاف الجوي في حين تم تسجيل تراجع طفيف في انبعاثات مادة HFC 23 وبالتالي يرجى مزيد توضيح هذين النقطتين. شكرا.
Thank you. I collect some more questions and then give the floor to Seb and Teep. Then I would like to go to India, Russian Federation, European Union and Canada. And that's the first batch I would like to give to Teep and Seb. So first India.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Let me start by thanking Government of Thailand for hosting the meeting and the excellent hospitality extended to us, and also to the Ozone Secretariat for the timely documentation for the meeting. I would also like to thank both SAP and TEEP for their reports as well as the excellent presentation. We would like to seek some clarifications both from the SAP as well as TEEP. First, let me start with SAP report. SAP has indicated that from 2019 to 2022, the global mean atmospheric abundance of HFC-23 increased at Earth's surface by 1.13 parts per trillion year, and this increase is 6% lower than the observed during 2016 to 2020. SAP further states that global emissions estimated from measured atmospheric abundances have decreased in 2022 as compared to 2019. How does this explain with the findings of the 2022 quadrennial assessment report, in which SAP observed that the global HFC-23 emissions derived from atmospheric observations are substantially higher than the emissions derived from activity-based estimates and are expected to grow in the coming decades? Second point is regarding the observation in the 2022 quadrennial assessment report, wherein it has been stated that the atmospheric HFC-23 levels are inconsistent with the substantial rise in emissions abatement reported to the UNFCCC. We would like to have more understanding of the methodology of reporting emission and abatement data under the UNFCCC and the Montreal Protocol, as well as the reasons for the variations in atmospheric measurements and reporting data on HFC-23 emissions, especially when atmospherically derived emissions estimates are not available for all countries that reported the HCFC-22 production. We would also like to understand what has been the impact of CDM and the provisions of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol in HFC-23 abatement. Will it be possible to provide party-wise and region-wise information to better understand the inferences drawn by the SAP? SAP report also states that HFC-23 is produced in the atmosphere from reactions that oxidize fluorinated gases present in the atmosphere, which is around 3% of global HFC-23 emissions in 2022. We would like to have more understanding on this, considering the impact of the CDM as well as the provisions of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. Also, there is a mention in the report about the unknown factors that might have been involved in the HFC-23 abatement. We would like to have more understanding of these factors also. Now, let me come to the TEEP report. In the case of TEEP report, it has been stated in the report that the generation of HFC-23 as a byproduct during the production of HCFC-22 is far greater than the amount of HFC-23 required for use as feedstock or for consumption, which is restricted as per the provisions of the Kigali Amendment. Details of HFC 23 relating to generation, consumption, and destruction are reported as a part of the Article 7 data by all the producing parties. Noting this, we would like the TEEP to clarify whether the byproduct generation of HFC 23 is beyond the 2 to 3%, including considering the other coordinated substances, and why the absence of information of consumption when all HCFC producing parties are obligated to report data under Article 7. My final point, we would like to have more understanding of the differences between SAP and TEEP estimates, which TEEP has indicated that currently cannot be explained. Thank you very much, Madam, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. And before I give the floor to the Russian Federation, I would like to remind everybody it's both Q&A and also in general statements or discussions, so you can do that together. So then I go to the Russian Federation. Please, you have the floor.
Спасибо, господин сопредседатель. Мы выступаем первый раз, поэтому прежде всего мы бы хотели высказать признательность правительству Таиланда за гостеприимство и секретариату за организацию нашей сессии. У меня вопрос к части доклада ТИАП МС-ТОК. Было упомянуто, что вы используете коэффициент для расчета производства, побочного производства ГФУ-23 при производстве ГХФУ-22. Хотелось бы знать, какой именно коэффициент вы используете при оценочных расчетах. Это первый вопрос. И второй вопрос. Как известно, оценочные расчеты в отношении ГФУ-23 от производства ГХФУ-22 относятся к производству. Вы даете же оценку и побочного производства, и эмиссии. Какие критерии вы используете для того, чтобы оценить эмиссию? Потому что если у вас нет достаточных данных по эмиссии, ведь есть существенная разница между эмиссией и побочным производством. Многие, например, в России сжигаются ГФУ-23, и эмиссии фактически нет. Вот на основании каких критериев вы же оцениваете общую эмиссию в атмосферу в отношении ГФУ-23? Спасибо.
Thank you. Then I would like to give the floor to the European Union.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and this delegation would like to welcome or thank for the welcome of the Thai people and its government for having us here, hosting us here, for the Secretariat, of course, for organizing a great meeting workshop yesterday, and hopefully for the whole of this week, and for the two co-chairs that will very ably, I would imagine, steer us through the meeting this week. And I would like to follow the guidance of the co-chair in making a few questions and then also some statements for discussions on this topic. So starting with the questions, and maybe starting with the questions to the SAP, it has struck us in particular that this discrepancy that we are talking about here, about bottom-up and top-down, has so suddenly appeared, apparently from one year to the next, 2014 to 2015. So maybe just once again for us as policymakers, how can this happen that a discrepancy so suddenly can appear? What is your explanation, and what may that indicate for the possible reason for this discrepancy? So that is maybe a major point of clarification that we would like to have. We thank, of course, the SAP for a great report with a lot of insight. a lot of clarity. And we've also noted that there is some data on the oxidation of HFCs in the atmosphere and the formation of HFC 23. And on this particular topic, we wonder, for these substances that do produce or break down into HFC 23 in the atmosphere, doesn't that mean that their actually global warming potential should be considered to be higher than what we consider it to be at the moment, because this is based on what it breaks down to, the original substance, but if there is a follow-up product that is very long-lived, maybe GWP need to be considered to be higher for the original substance. That has a question. To the TIAB, we are seeking some clarifications. You may have given that in your report and also in the good presentation this morning. But just to be very clear for our understanding here, does this TIAB believe that there could be any other significant sources of R23 out there that are not part of this analysis? Please just confirm that to us. And very similarly, do you believe that, and that's maybe to both TIAB and SAP, that a significant part of the discrepancy can be explained by the uncertainties, any uncertainties, and also on uncertainties that you still have on the other sources of R23? So is there any explanation discrepancy to be looked for in there, in these areas, or should we rather be focusing on the production sector as probably where we should be looking to explain the discrepancy? So please clarify that to us again. So I mentioned we are very happy with the two reports, so let's also include the TIAB in our praise of the work and results presented. We're very concerned that there seems to be a very significant discrepancy still confirmed, and please let us know if that is beyond the uncertainties. It's in a magnitude that is quite relevant for climate change, so it's not a trivial matter we're talking about here. You have given us data on other sources and relevant contributions, and again, our understanding is that these will not help us to explain the discrepancy, and it's unlikely that there might be other unknown uses out there that might. So actually, probably we need to be looking at the production sector as the main area to look for explaining the discrepancy. There is some good news that there seems to be a decrease of the discrepancy since 2019, and I think the SAP in the presentation just called this improved mitigation, so apparently there may be some effective action already underway, but of course the discrepancy still remains to this day, so maybe there needs to be more of that. We think this issue needs to be addressed by all parties together. We need to make sure that efficient abatement technologies are installed and are used. This abatement technology has been around for decades, so we need to be able to prevent such emissions that are clearly preventable. We also would like to call for transparency in reporting. We call on all parties that have production of R23 to give the data on generation, whether it's used, emitted, or destroyed, and that would then also inform us better. And hopefully our work on the reporting sheet may help us in getting these data. We also, and that was pointed out also by the TIAB in the presentation, there is comprehensive UNFCCC guidance on MRV, on measuring, on estimating and reporting emissions of R23, so we hope that all parties look at that guidance and use it when making their reporting. Also, we urge parties to share relevant existing monitoring data openly so that the scientific community can exploit all available sources so that we have the best data available and we can reduce any remaining uncertainties. And that's in particular important, as we heard again, that for some regions there is less data available than for others. So we need to have a good coverage of all regions on this matter and on other matters. And well, as a conclusion, we think we need to keep working on this issue and we need to take effective action where this is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have two more speakers on my list. It's Canada and the US. And I would like to ask if there are other speakers. Yes, I see more coming. So then I have now on my list Canada, US, Australia, something reserved for parties, but I don't know who it is, China, UK, and Bangladesh. I would like to give the floor now to Canada, and then go to the second group of parties who would like to speak. But after Canada, I would like to ask Teep and Seb to respond. Please, Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And first of all, I'd like to express our gratitude to the government of Thailand for their warm welcome. I would say very warm welcome in Bangkok. And also thank the Ozone Secretariat for the organization of this meeting and the very interesting workshop that our delegation and others attended yesterday. Also like to thank very much the Scientific Assessment Panel and the Technology Economic Assessment Panels for their additional reports on this issue. I think now it's probably the third reports that we consider in a couple of years. And even though the SAP had been asked to provide an update, we see that they provided a lot of new substantial information that I think does bring our understanding of this issue a step significantly further. I'll just start with a few questions for both the SAP and the TEEP, and I'd have to say, Mr. Co-Chair, will probably leave it to your judgment, but we may go into contact groups, so perhaps some of the details of these questions, they could wait until later. SAP and TEEP can feel free to answer what they can now, but if they require more time, for us, that's okay. So for the SAP, noting that scientific atmospheric studies have linked 20 to 50% of unexplained HFC 23 emissions to Eastern China. Could they explain a little bit more sort of, the reasons for this relatively wide gap, from 20 to 50%? And are there possibilities of trying to narrow that gap in the future? Do we have enough atmospheric monitoring capacity to be able to pin down a little bit more? Because that does seem to be quite a wide margin. And similarly, what would be needed in the future in terms of atmospheric measurements, additional research and analysis to be able to identify potentially other geographical sources, or basically to be able to identify where the remaining 50 to 80% of the emissions may be coming from. As well, we noted that there were 3 HCFC 22 producing parties where there was no atmospheric data. We're wondering if the SAP can provide us with a little bit of information on whether possibly some data may be forthcoming for some of these parties, or if there are perhaps other ways in which information could be collected over these parties and regions. With respect to the TEEP report, which we find very instructive as well, one part that confuses us a little bit is there's an overall estimate of consumption of HFC 23 of slightly over 2,600 tons. And then there are 3 uses that are identified. And we understand that these essentially should be the only 3 main uses of HFC 23. Fire suppression, ultra-low refrigeration, and etchant chamber cleaning. But the TEEP didn't provide sort of an estimated consumption for each of these sectors. I think they did it just for one of them. But based on their sort of qualitative estimates of the use in these sectors, they seem to be quite small, and we don't see how they would contribute to 2,600 metric tons of consumption. So maybe this is a question of us misunderstanding some of the information there, but we would be interested to know If there are perhaps other unknown consumption besides those three sectors, or perhaps if the TEEP is able to provide us with a very rough breakdown of consumption among those three sectors. And then the final question for the TEEP was the category of potential emissions, which they refer to as HCFC 22, plant waste and products stream, which has a wide range of 10 tons to 1,000 tons. Perhaps they could explain to us a little bit what is involved in that particular category, and you know why there is also such a wide range of potential emissions for this category. Canada, we remain concerned that there remains a significant emission gap between top-down and bottom-up measurements when it comes to HFC 23 emissions. We do note, you know, that there has been a reduction of that gap over the 2019-2022 period, and that's good news. We don't know if this is going to be a long-term trend or if this is just a blip. But in any case, it's still a significant gap which could continue in the future. So we do think it is a very serious issue that parties should continue to attempt to address. And we think that without additional information and data from parties, from industries, the TEEP and the SAP have probably taken this issue, you know, almost as far as they could go, at least in the near future. And I think at this meeting, we're interested in seeing what we can do as parties to provide more information and data to the TEEP and the SAP, and along the same lines of what has been suggested, for instance, by India and by the EU, having more information on the different approaches that parties may be using to determine their emissions, also to determine the generation rates that their facilities are using for HFC 23, and also the various approach to reporting of those facilities, and then how the government takes those reports and reports subsequently under Article 7 of the Montreal Protocol. We'll also be interested to know if there are verification mechanisms at facilities or that the government may use to check basically the emission data that is coming from these facilities. We have to remember that this is a compliance requirement. It's very different than a compliance requirement related to consumption and production that could be more easily verified, but nevertheless, it is a compliance issue. So we think that in areas where there are evident inconsistencies or large differences between emissions derived from reporting and emissions derived from atmospheric monitoring, that it would be incumbent on those parties to investigate what are the potential reasons for these discrepancies, and subsequently to inform the rest of the parties on any results of those investigations. So that's something that we would be interested also in discussing at this meeting. A final issue that we would like to raise, and we're conscious that this is perhaps overlapping with the next agenda item, but it relates very much to reporting of HFC 23 and having as much information and data as possible available to the parties and to our advisory bodies, is with respect to the reporting on HFC 23 under Data Form 6, which I think is very germane to our discussion here, because only the emission component of those forms are mandatory. And as we saw, the reporting on the amounts generated, stored, and destroyed on these forms is voluntary. And we're conscious actually that from what we saw from the report from the TEEP, it does seem that there are several parties that are actually reporting on this anyways, and that's great. But we're wondering whether that should be consistent among all parties. Now, I'm not sure if this is something that is also could be discussed under the next agenda item, but we just wanted to flag this as an issue that we think parties should be looking at. I'll stop here, but obviously a lot more could be said on this discussion, but thank you.
Thank you, Canada. I will read out the list of speakers I have in front of me now. That's the United States, Australia, China, UK, Bangladesh, and Norway. I really would like to ask if other parties would like to take the floor. I don't see any other party, and there is a request from an NGO to speak as well, IEA. So I now will close that list, and I will go to this, let's say, first a TEEP and SEP response to the questions now, and then I go to the second row, what I just mentioned, from the United States till Norway, and then an observer as well. Okay. TEEP. They will need 5 minutes, so... please stay in the room because there will be responses from SAP and TEEP. So they just there were a lot of questions, so they need a little bit of time. So, but please stay in the room. SAP can start now with responding to the questions, please, Steve.
Yes, thank you. First, thank you for the questions. I would just start first by responding to Tunisia's question about the difference between atmospheric concentrations and emissions and how their trends can be opposing. And I would say that atmospheric concentrations increase as emissions happen and augment the amount of the chemical in the atmosphere. But when emissions decrease, the concentration doesn't also decrease. Concentrations in the atmosphere decrease according to the chemical's natural removal rate from the atmosphere, or what we call its atmospheric lifetime. So because HFC 23 has a 200-year lifetime, an emission adds to its abundance, but its concentration will never decrease more than 0.5% per year. That would be if emissions were zero. So there's a disconnect between emissions and concentrations. I hope that helps clarify. I'm happy to further clarify if I was unsuccessful there. With respect to India, they had a number of questions, and I guess I would say that what we've supplied here is an update to what was available in the 2022 ozone assessment. The last year of information, measurements, emissions, that was discussed in the 2022 ozone assessment was for the year 2020. And we've added information for the year 2021 and 2022 to this assessment. And they have been added seamlessly in a way that didn't result in any changes in the information that was provided for those earlier years. India asked about methodology, and I would say that methodologies for deriving global emissions have to do with measurements in the remote atmosphere and how a chemical's concentration changes over time, and information about its atmospheric lifetime. And those methodologies are discussed in previous ozone assessments, and we also included a section in this report on how emissions are derived from atmospheric concentration measurements, both on a global scale and on a regional scale. I'd be happy to supply some additional clarification if needed. Both Canada and India mentioned the incomplete regional information. And if there are any data forthcoming or expected in the near future from those three countries, I don't know about all the countries, but I will say, given that the organization I'm part of makes measurements across the US, it is our hope through the measurements that we're making across the US that we could have estimates of HFC 23 emissions constrained by the atmospheric observations within the next year or so, certainly in time for the next ozone assessment. There was a question about the atmospheric production indicated as being 3%. It's actually no more than 3% of current emissions, and it's likely to be substantially less than that contribution. Hence, I don't expect, based on those quantities, that atmospheric production would have influenced any consistency in reporting versus atmospheric-derived estimates during the CDM period or even during the Kigali period, or that has happened since that period of time, given that quantity of production is fairly small. EU asked if the GWPs of chemicals that actually result in the production of HFC 23, whether or not those GWPs should be reassessed. I think the SAP agrees that that's a reasonable consideration, and since this is new information coming to light for them as an organization, it seems a reasonable thing to consider in the future, and I think that they will be considering that, whether and how that actually is reflected in the next assessment is to be determined. The EU also asked about the sudden appearance of the gap after 2015. And I'll say we have a figure in the assessment, and I showed one today, that showed that gap and its sudden appearance after 2015, and how it's coincident in time with some reporting based destruction. And we created that figure in an effort to show that they're coincident in time, even though it's not necessarily true that they're causal. It's not necessarily true that they're connected in cause. I will refer to the TEEP for any further discussion of that point, in that they're the experts with respect to understanding if there are other potential sources that might have increased during that period of time. EU also asked, and I think TEEP emphasized this, I would also like to emphasize it, that the discrepancies in recent years between the expectation and the atmospheric derived emissions certainly are very far beyond our uncertainties, at least with respect to how emissions are derived globally from atmospheric measurements. And with respect to the 20 to 50% difference, or 20 to 50% contribution from emissions from China since, in particular, 2020 that Canada brought up. The reasons for that wide range is that emissions from Canada have not been, emissions from Canada have not been, no, emissions from China have been constrained for different regions, for eastern China and for northern China. And those emissions, it's difficult to combine those emissions to understand what the total contribution of emissions throughout the country might be. And the 20 to 50% actually encompasses the emissions from the different regions. The emissions from northern China would account for 20% of the global total, and emissions from eastern China in that study corresponded to the 50%. Could this wide margin be decreased in the future? I would say yes. There is substantial, the wonderful thing about what's happened in China in recent years is that there's many additional measurements of fluorinated chemicals in that country. And I think a comprehensive analysis of all those measurements together would help us tremendously reduce that margin further. And I think I will pass it on to TEEP now.
Thank you, Steve. I'll get to to some of the additional comments that we can make in response to some of the remarks from the SAP, but I'll take them in turn because that's probably going to be easier for me. Okay, from the delegate of India, we had the question regarding generation rates of HFC 23, and to clarify whether the generation rates are beyond, I think the numbers mentioned were 2 to 3%. In the report, we provide estimates based on, there's a range of estimates based on HFC 23 generation from 22 production using IPCC default generation factors of 1.5 to 3%. And we also include a kind of a generation rate that we calculated based on the generation data that is reported by parties for the years 2020 and 2021, and that generation rate was 2.4% based on the information that parties reported on generation and their HCFC 22 production. So hopefully that answers that question. There was another question saying, why is there an absence of consumption data? We present the total consumption data that is available to us, but we don't report the by party consumption data because we're not permitted to do that because it's commercially, it's confidential information. So that's why we only include totals of consumption. The question from Russia related to the coefficient of HFC 23 emissions from 22 production that we used. Perhaps to clarify first that the HFC 23 emissions data that we present in the report is a mixture of reported data from parties under Article 7 for HFC 23 emissions and estimations that the TEEP has made of other potential emission sources based on information available to us. We decided to only include the HFC 23 emissions data reported by parties, which we believe to be predominantly from 23 emitted from 22 production. So in terms of a coefficient, if you calculated the coefficient of 836 tonnes, which was what the amount that was reported by parties of HFC 23 emissions, from the 22 production, which was 1,200,000 tonnes, that would give you a coefficient of, hang on, it's here. We calculated it, that's why we took so long coming back to microphone, 0.07%. And it's worth noting that in a recent paper with a well-operated 22 and polymer plant, that it was reported that HFC 23 emissions had a coefficient of about 0.19%. So the reported data, 0.0%, measured data, 0.19%. Okay. Then we had a question. Yes, I think I covered off on the why is there a gap between emissions, what we use to arrive at our estimations. As I said, we used a combination of reported data for emissions and our own estimates. And our own estimates relate to those smaller, relatively smaller sources. Having said that, there's a large range for some of those sources as well that we provide in the report because of the lack of information available to us. Now I will get to the questions from the EU relating to the change from 2014 to 2015. There's no new source of production that would emit HFC 23 that we know of. And it's also worth noting that there was a recent paper that looked at fluorspar use, which is, and that, based on that paper, there's no new uses that we're aware of. All right. The question, another question from the EU related to could we clarify whether there are any other significant sources The easy answer, no. Not that we're aware of. Is there any discrepancy other than the production sector? As we outline in the report, there are kind of smaller categories of use compared with the 22 production. The 22 production is 95% of the HFC 23 generation. So that is, the 22 is the major source of HFC 23 generation. And then after that, of course, there's whether it's abated or not in terms of emissions. Wanting to understand uncertainties. All right, then we had I think I've covered off on all of those. Then we had questions from Canada asking about consumption, and that consumption is around 1,000 tonnes. I think the question was, there's a lack of information for the, the breakdown of what that would be for the sectors. We provide the breakdown because there is information publicly available on the electronics and semiconductor manufacturing, and that's 720 tonnes. So based on that, you could assume that the remainder, which is 280 tonnes, would be consumed in those other sectors, which was the fire suppression and very low temperature refrigeration. Then there was a question about the 22 plant waste, which has a range in the report that we provide in the report in terms of HFC 23 emissions of 10 to 1,000 tonnes of HFC 23 emissions coming from HFC 22 plant waste and product streams. And as we outline in the report, in addition to the main process vents, which is where you would be measuring kind of emissions of HFC 23 coming from, and then diverting it to incineration, things of that sort. In addition to those main process vents where abatement is typically employed, 23 is known to be able to leave an HCFC 22 production plant in various co-product and waste streams. And we outlined that in the 2023 report, and it's also included in Annex 1 to a certain extent of this report as well. The extent to which the HFC 23 content of these streams have been included in the reported 23 emissions from 22 production is uncertain to us. So there may be some parties that are reporting 23 emissions that include that in their reporting, but we don't know that. So we have to estimate a range there, and this uncertainty, along with the degree of HFC 23 emission mitigation employed on those streams, which is also an unknown to us, and also, it would vary depending on the plant, is reflected in that large range of estimated emissions that's from 10 to 1,000 tonnes. And I think that covers off. Thank you.
Thank you for the answers. And then I would like to go for the next round, and I have the USA on my list, please.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Good morning, colleagues, and thanks to the government of Thailand for welcoming us here. Wanted to express our appreciation to the SAP and the TEEP for these reports. They're really quite excellent reports. And I think there's a lot of quite significant and important and environmentally relevant information that is included in these documents. So I have a few questions, and then I understand, Co-Chair, you're combining both questions and discussion. So I'll start with questions and then move from there. But I think it would be useful to have a little bit of an understanding maybe of the broader framing of the significance of this issue. So I wanted to start by asking SAP if my understanding is correct, that if you look at the forcing, the warming forcing of HFCs in total, that HFC 23 is somewhere in the ballpark of about 15% of the total. If that's wrong, maybe I could ask the HFC, the SAP to correct that, but also to give us a sense. I'm just trying to figure out, my general impression is this is actually an issue that matters a lot. The numbers are big, quite big, but if they could do a little bit of, you know, we're here because we care about HFCs, and I think this is a pretty significant fraction of the overall HFC forcing. So if they could speak to that, that would be quite helpful from my perspective. The gap, as I understand it, and this is just the gap, it's 10.5 to 12.5 kilotons. That's a little bit less than it was, so that was in 2022, I think, a little bit less than it was in prior years. But when I say less, that's still about 170 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, if I'm doing the math correctly. Maybe SAP can confirm my math on that, but again, just to understand the magnitude of this, I think these numbers are quite large, and it's really worth understanding that. And then a related question, this is sort of SAP and TEEP combined, but I guess as I'm reading what you're saying, basically we've identified the emissions for about 20% of what the atmosphere is showing are the actual emissions. Is that correct? Just based roughly on the numbers that I've done. And I say 20%, I mean, another way to look at that is that means 80%-ish of the emissions are basically unaccounted for at this point. And if, in fact, the magnitude is large, that would be a pretty concerning fact. So maybe on that one, SAP or TEEP could opine on that as to whether I'm understanding that. Just back to a couple last points for SAP. So the atmospheric oxidation point, which is, so before we were talking about a gap of over 10 kilotons, atmospheric oxidation, I just want to make sure the magnitude, you said something like, you know, up to about 0.4 kilotons. I just wonder, is there a range there, or do you only have the up to framing? It would just be useful to know, because it would give us a bit more of a sense of maybe what the actual number is in that particular context. And then just the last thing for SAP, I actually think, and I'm not sure there's been a lot of mention of it thus far, but your figure 7 and also in the executive summary on the third paragraph on page 4, it talks about the HFC 23 emissions estimates derived for Eastern China, and we basically have a study that provides this information. The derived emissions were 5.7 to 9.5 kilotons per year, which is dramatically higher than the amounts that have been reported. So you spoke to this a few moments ago, I think in response, I think Canada may have mentioned something along these lines. One thing we were trying to parse was sort of the estimates from Eastern China and Northern China. You said those are not additive in some sense. I also assume that geographically they also don't necessarily cover the entire country. But is there further information maybe that is coming that could shed additional light on this? Could you say anything more about like how you sort of, how and if you can get some sense based on these sort of two different geographical estimates, just to understand a little bit more, if there's anything more that could be said about sort of what those estimates of emissions might be, which are quite substantial, representing as much as half of the gap in emissions that we're talking about here. I think to us, this was perhaps sort of the clearest and most direct information that we have. Like in some sense, we see a global gap, but we also have some very specific regional information, which is telling us, I think in a more specific geographical context, where this discrepancy is coming from. So that's all I had for the TPON questions that's all I had for the SAP. For the TEEP, just a couple of items of clarification. One is, do you know the volume of HFC 23 that is produced by lines that make HFC 23 intentionally? Meaning not the lines that are collecting byproduct and storing it and either destroying it or selling it or whatever is happening with that material, but lines that actually are producing 23 for purposes of consumptive uses or feedstock. So not the byproduct, but intentional production of 23. I think that just could be a useful yardstick to have some information about if you have that. The second item is just, so the gap we're talking about here, it's 10.5 to 12,500 tons. It's pretty big. So given the scale of this, what are the processes around the world that are capable of generating volumes of 23 that could be like large enough to explain this gap? And then separate, what percent of total global HCFC 22 production is in China? If you could provide that, I think that would be helpful. And then the last question I had for TEEP, it just relates to table 4.1, and Canada mentioned this as well. I mean, listen, a lot of the conclusions we draw from table 4.1 is, listen, there's a number of small consumptive uses and emissions, and it might be really interesting to find out more about emissions from fire suppression, but they're not actually going to explain the gap that we're looking at. So the items on the table that are perhaps of greater interest, Canada mentioned the HCFC 22 plant waste, 10 to 1,000 tons. I think that also doesn't really explain the gap much, but it's a pretty big range going up to 1,000 tons. Maybe the question on that one, as well as the TFE HFP manufacturing line, might just be, is there anything further that TEEP could do to provide a little, like to reduce how big that range is? I don't think, even if you tell us it's going to explain the gap, but the higher ends of those ranges are, getting to the significant level as compared to most of the other items that are in there. So those are really the questions that I had. So, Co-Chair, sorry, it's a little difficult to combine both questions and discussion, but just to say, from our perspective, I think the reports that we've gotten are thought-provoking and interesting, and I think they're consequential. We think there's going to need to be a follow-up on those. I'm going to hold my specific comments on the next agenda item until then, so the forms, I'm going to not delve into that. But specifically on this issue, we do see the need for a draft decision to have some further follow-up work. The reason I was asking those framing questions on how big is this is I think the answer is it's quite big and consequential to the climate system. So I think this is an issue that merits further attention by the parties, given how large the deviation is and given how large the associated climate forcing is. I think in the end, we all share a common goal to achieve a reduction in emissions, so the atmosphere is not seeing such an increase over time that it currently is. But I think what we would like to do is, I think by this evening, we hope to have the text for a draft decision. Stating it very generally, we think there probably needs to be an additional request to parties on information sharing, data collection, reporting. We probably need to request parties to make sure they're doing the work they need to implement their obligations. And then I think there's some very, specific follow-ups for SAP and TEEP that I think we would also like to see. Not a completely new report, but I think it's more a specific supplemental to answer some of the very particular questions that have been raised here, because I think we have quite a good report in front of us. So, Mr. Co-Chair, I would beg your indulgence. We wanted to listen to SAP and TEEP present before we put forward a draft decision. I think we've now been informed by what we've heard from them. And I think we would hope to submit a draft decision tonight with a hope to introduce it tomorrow. And then I believe there will need to be a focused discussion on this in a contact group that would focus just on this issue. So I'll leave it there. And obviously, when we come forward with our CRP, we would come back to the plenary to introduce that. Thank you.
Thank you, US, and good to know you are working on a CRP. I would like to give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Firstly, we would like to thank the Ozone Secretariat for their preparations for this meeting, which have been extensive. We would like to thank the co-chairs for guiding us this week, and we wish you luck. Timing is already out the window for this session, but that's okay. And we would also like to note our very warm welcome to Bangkok, both by its people, its weather, and its food. We would also particularly like to thank the TEEP and the SAP for their reports on HFC 23 emissions in relation to decision 35/7. The SAP report does provide some good news, and this was emphasised in its presentation to us this morning, that the global mean abundances, atmospheric abundances of HFC 23 only increased by 1.13 parts per trillion, which is down from the 1.2 parts per trillion observed during previous years, 2016 to 2020. So that is some good news. The other good news that was provided was that the global emissions of HFC 23 estimated from atmospheric abundances have also decreased, and we saw that in the graphs that the SAP provided to us this morning, from a high of 17.3 kilotons to 13.9 kilotons in 2022, despite an increase in the total production of HCFC 22. However, as the SAP has indicated, and I think some parties have commented, we are also concerned about the very wide gap that has been identified in emissions estimated from global abundances and the emissions reported by parties, which cannot be explained by any of the usual mechanisms. We also note that new reporting of HFC 23 emissions in eastern China indicates significantly higher emissions than its officially reported emissions, and that they could account for up to half the gap seen by scientists and expressed in the report that's before us at this meeting. The TEEP report also highlights the significant gap between HFC 23 generated, which has been estimated using standard production rates from HCFC 22 production, and reported production of less than 1,000 metric tonnes in 2022. TEEP estimates HFC 23 emissions from known emission sources to be around 1,500 to 3,500 tonnes per year in the period 2020 to 2024. But in comparison, the SAP estimates global HFC emissions of nearly 14,000 tonnes based on atmospheric observations. So there are gaps in numbers from the TEEP and the SAP that are actually too great to be put down to missing errors, missing data, or unknown sources, as has been explained by the TEEP. The TEEP notes that possibly some improvements in reporting under Form 6 might reduce some of these gaps. It also notes that perhaps some guidance on how reporting of 23 production and emissions should be provided. This seems like a reasonable suggestion. And the SAP also notes that some recent studies on 23 emissions in China, which should provide impetus for it to dig deeper into the reporting from some of its facilities in its eastern regions. There have been lots of clarifying questions, and we're not going to add to your very long list of questions, but we do urge all countries with HCFC 22 and 23 production, and where there are identified discrepancies in their emissions, to re-examine their policy, regulatory and reporting frameworks to ensure they are able to capture all production and emissions data as accurately as possible. We did note the proposal from the US to put forward a CRP by this evening, I think, and we would be very happy to work with the US and other delegations on a way forward. I think we agree that the quantum of the issue that we're looking at this meeting, and it has been provided in the reports, is quite significant, and we would like to see a path forward identified at this meeting, so we can get a better handle on the data, and for countries to put their best efforts into reconciling the discrepancies that have been identified. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Australia. And indeed, we are a little bit behind schedule because we were optimistic. So the next one on my list is China.
谢谢主席。首先，我谨代表中国代表团，感谢臭氧秘书处和执行秘书为筹备会议所做的周到准备，感谢共同主席的辛勤工作，同时也感谢泰国政府的热情接待。我们感谢 SAP 和 TEEP 一直以来在缔约方大会框架下，就 HFC 23大气监测和排放情况等方面持续开展研究工作，并起草了相关报告，为缔约方提供了重要的信息。针对这两份报告和刚才的介绍及讨论，中方愿与参会代表分享我们的看法。首先，关于 SAP 报告中对中国有关情况的表述问题，我们发现 SAP 报告对中国有关 HFC 23的情况做了很大篇幅的描述，配以多年期的变化图表，多个点位的监测数据对比分析，而对其他国家的数据陈述比较笼统简单。对此我们表示理解。中国的 HCFC 22、HFC 及其他氟化学产品产量在全球占比较高。中国 HFC 23的产生和排放量较其他国家大是非常正常的。 如果大气监测结果与地面报告数据存在差距，这一差距大部分来自中国，也不难理解。但是我们遗憾地看到 SAP 报告中似乎出现了一份科学报告不该出现的评价和主观臆断。报告多次提及，中国报告的销毁量从数量和时间段都恰好与全球大气监测结果与地面报告数据间差距相吻合，且报告也多次出现中国未报告的 HFC 23排放量这一说法。我们想就此提问 SAP 是否想表达全球数据差距就是由中国引起的，把全球的问题变成了中国一家的问题，意味着这个问题得到了解决？报告中所谓的未报告提法，是否想暗示中国存在知情不报的情况？我们相信这些并不是 SAP 想要表达的。然而，来参加地方大会的各国代表，并不都是精通专业技术知识的科学研究者，很多都是管理人员、外交人员。我们担心，代表们在看到 SAP 这样的描述后，很难不产生一些倾向性的联想。过去几十年间，议定书的发展长期依赖于 SAP 等科学机构的研究成果，也一直以其基于科学的决策而骄傲。我们希望 SAP 等科学机构秉持科学的权威性、中立性，切勿贸然做出引导性陈述。为了更全面地了解全球 HFC 23排放情况和各国数据报送情况、差距的幅度和变化情况，我们建议 SAP 可以按照对中国 HFC 23排放研究的方法，对其他副产 HFC 23的缔约方情况进行同等方式的研究，进一步完善报告。那么，回到 HFC 23排放数据差异研究本身，我们注意到 SAP 和 TIP 报告明确指出，目前对 HFC 23排放问题仍有很多方面的情况并不明晰，需要开展进一步研究。中国对 HFC 23排放数据差异保持极大关注，在认真研究 SAP、TIP 报告的基础上，结合国内科研院所的研究，我们也愿意和各方分享我们的一些看法。我们认为，关于差异的原因，有2个重要的方面尚未得到很好的解答。首先，关于排放源和真实的 HFC 23产生量和排放量，一是 HCFC 22副产 HFC 23排放机理仍然不明确。我们注意到，2024年8月，《自然》杂志发表的国际科研团队对某 A2 缔约方 HCFC 22生产装置开展 HFC 23排放研究的有关成果。该研究显示，即使以最佳实践技术对 HFC 23排放进行管控，仍监测到 HFC 23产生量的约10%排放至大气。然而，目前所有缔约方报送的 HFC 23排放量均远低于该比例，甚至不少缔约方报送的排放数据接近于0。中方的一些初步研究表明， HCFC 22生产过程中存在着技术上难以实现收集和准确衡量的无组织排放。可见，我们对 HFC 23排放机理仍无法完全识别。对于 HCFC 22副产 HFC 23真实的排放量研究，仍处于摸索阶段。二是来自 HCFC 22以外的来源是否被科学识别，其排放量有多大？ TIP 和 SAP 报告都明确指出，存在 HCFC 22以外的 HFC 23来源，包括其他的 HFC、PFC、PTFE、HFP 等产品生产过程都会副产 HFC 23。在 IPCC 指南中，氟化工生产和转化过程产生 HFC 23的副产默认比例为4.4%。TIP 报告出于一些原因没有采纳这个比例，但是 我们要看到，不论是 IPCC 的指南，还是 TIP 报告的演算，都是在一定假设的前提下，采用某种方法学推算出的数据，不排除存在着相当大的误差。全球氟化工产品产量至少数百万吨 ，PTFE、HFP 等含氟聚合物产量仍在持续增长。在这样的情况下，每一设施生产过程中少量的难以捕获的 HFC-23泄漏，即便低于4.4%，也会造成较大的排放总量存在于大气之中。第二，关于报送数据差异的普遍性，我们注意到 SAP 和 TIP 报告均指出，在已经报告 HFC-23数据的缔约方中，各缔约方报告的 HFC-23总排放量明显低于相应大气繁衍结果，即各缔约方报告的排放量与大气繁衍结果的差距普遍存在。从秘书处公布的缔约方报告的 HFC-23排放数据来看，各缔约方基本都存在报送数据在年度间的波动，有的差异非常大。从绝对值来看，甚至存在高达100倍的差异。事实上，近年来因为调整测算方法，中国报送的数据差异也比较大。测算方法不明晰，是因为我们对 HFC-23排放的认知有限，报告与监测能力有限，对无组织排放在技术上还无法实现测量等等。中方相信，这些都是相关缔约方遇到的共性问题。对于这些问题的存在，目前各国报送的排放数据与实际排放数据之间到底有多大的差距，还难以准确衡量。相应的，我们认为各国报送的数据可以作为 SAP、TIP 研究的参考，但如果以此为准确数据来评判排放差距，本身就是不够科学的做法。自2022年 SAP 报告提出 HFC-23排放数据差异以来，议定书下的缔约方大会、工作组会议已经过多次讨论 ，SAP、TIP 也应要求不断补充研究。SAP、TIP 几乎已经穷尽了所有的已知信息来进行分析和推断，但并不能实现我们想要的清晰解释。这些不确定在很大程度上是由于科学技术以及我们的认知还没有发展到清晰解决问题的程度，也在于现有技术能力，特别是发展中国家缔约方的能力还存在着很大欠缺。比如，我们该如何最大限度减少 HCFC-22生产过程中 HFC-23的无组织排放？这些方面需要我们想办法改善。中方就下一步工作有一些初步的想法，我们也计划在今天晚些时候提交一份 CRP， 愿和缔约方在接触组中进一步探讨。关于中方在消除 HFC-23排放上所做的努力和相关研究，因为时间关系不再赘述。中方愿与感兴趣的缔约方进行交流。谢谢主席。
Thank you, China, and also good to know that you're preparing a CRP on this issue. And let's say I go now to my list. We have only a couple of minutes left, or let's say not much of an hour. I already closed the list, and I had on my list the UK, Bangladesh, Norway, and then IEA. So I really would like to urge you to be concise in your statements or questions. And please, first the UK.
Everyone. As this is the first time that this delegation is taking the floor, we would like to take the opportunity to thank the Secretariat for organising the meeting the government of Thailand for hosting us, and to the people of China for their warm welcome. The UK would also like to thank the SAP and the TEEP for their presentations, insightful reports, and the valuable continued work on this important matter. The UK shares many of the concerns set out and raised by other parties, and we shan't repeat those here in the interest of time. Just to note that whilst the most recent data shows that there's been some reduction in the global HFC 23 emissions, estimated from measured atmospheric abundances, the gap remains greater than expected, and these discrepancies remain significant. This issue therefore remains a great concern for this party. We note the proposal from the US and China to put forward CRPs on this matter, and we would welcome this and the opportunity for further work and discussion with parties to support further action on this important matter. Thank you.
Thank you by being so concise. And Bangladesh.
Thank you, co-chairs, and good afternoon, colleagues. At the outset, let my delegation convey our sincere appreciation to the Ozone Secretariat and the Government of Thailand for providing excellent arrangements and hospitality for our meetings today and the following days. And I also take the opportunity to congratulate SAP and TEEP for their good work. So I had several questions, but that have been already raised by the previous distinguished speakers. So I will not repeat those questions that I wanted to put forward. But we understand that in terms of the difference that we are seeing, it is understandable, and I feel that in terms of the top-down and bottom-up approach, there might be some differences. But the point is that we have to reduce the differences. If you see that SAP report, the difference started growing since 2014, and it reached a very peak in 2019, and then it reduced to some extent, but still there are differences according to 2022 estimation. So so collectively we should try to reduce this gap in terms of atmosphere derived and reporting based assessments. And at the same time, we also see that there are some large differences between TEEP and SAP estimates of global HFC 23 estimations. So I feel that the two bodies need to work together in a very coherent and synergistic manner so that the difference might be reduced in the coming days. And in the reports, they have also mentioned some uncertainty and some other technical related issues that need to be clarified further in their future deliberations. And they also mentioned, particularly, TEEP has mentioned about the improvement of our reporting process. And they said that we may think of or consider refinement to the data form 6. So I feel that we should discuss how to improve our reporting process and reporting formats. At the same time, we also feel the need of having some extension of our assessment through atmosphere assessment, through the observatory centers, so that we can cover the remaining regions and countries that has been left out under our existing estimations. So we feel that since time is not on our hand, so I will be very brief, that we need to improve our process as we move along to the next course of action. And I sincerely appreciate all of you for the hard work and dedication. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bangladesh. And then the last party on my list, as I closed the session earlier, is Norway.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We are very pleased to be back in Bangkok and are very thankful for the warm hospitality of the people of Thailand. We would like to thank the Secretariat for organizing the meeting and the successful workshop yesterday. We want to thank particularly the SAP and the TIP for providing us with those reports. It's a very useful piece of work, despite the lack of information available that would have been very valuable to increase further our understanding of the issue. We do not have any specific question to the expert panels, but would like to share some views. We are quite encouraged to see the positive signs of reduction in atmospheric concentration levels of HFC 23 since the peak year in 2019. This makes us believe that regulations that have been put in place by countries that recently ratified Kigali will help decreasing emission further. We will follow with interest to see if the reduction trends will be confirmed in the future, and would also like to point out that, as previous experience have shown us, ensuring a proper enforcement of regulation is also key to maintain compliance. Still, we have concerns regarding the huge discrepancies between the estimates provided by the SAP and the TIP. This is assuming large emissions of HFC 23 are taking place, and we are looking forward to further discuss this matter in a contact group. Before closing my intervention, we would also like to shed some light on the consumption of HFC 23 in refrigeration, fire protection, semiconductor and electronic manufacturing. Although emission estimates from those uses are much lower compared to the emissions arising from the production of fluorinated substances, we consider that any emissions that can be avoided are not negligible in terms of contribution to global warming. And we would like to encourage all parties to consider the benefits that could be achieved by giving priority and addressing this specific consumption when elaborating their national plans for phasing down HFCs. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you. I overlooked one party when I closed the list. That was Saudi Arabia. So you have the floor. And then we have to see how much time we have left. So we are really running close. So please, can you be concise?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يود الوفد السعودي تقديم الشكر والتقدير لمملكة تايلاند حكومة وشعبا على حسن الضيافة، والشكر موصول لأمانة الاتفاقية الموقرة ورئاسة المؤتمر، وإذ نشكر للجميع مشاركتهم البناءة في هذا الاجتماع، وانطلاقا من النجاحات اتفاقية فيينا وبروتوكول مونتريال، والذي أصبح أنموذجا يحتذى لجميع الاتفاقيات والتعهدات الدولية، إلا أننا نرى بل نؤكد على الفرق العلمية المساندة لهذا المؤتمر توخي المصداقية والأمانة العلمية في عرض تقاريرها، كي لا تصبح تلك التقارير مصدر خوف وقلق وتوجس خطر دولي، وإنما لتكن تقارير تلك الفرق لتكن تقارير تلك الفرق بل ينبغي أن تكون ذات مخرجات مبنية على تقارير علمية مؤكدة، وليست على دراسات احتمالية ليس إلا. كذلك الإشارة إلى تنامي بعض الغازات، ومن ثم افتراض أنها ناجمة عن انبعاثات دول معينة، ثم تدول تلك الاحتمالات، يقلل مصداقية تقاريرنا وأمانتها العلمية. وفي الختام، إن وفد بلادي يدعو الجميع وخاصة فرقنا العلمية الموقرة توخي المصداقية والشفافية لنبني على تلك التقارير قرارات تكاملية حيادية تخدم البشرية جمعاء بحياديتها التامة. وختاما أشكر لكم حسن الاستماع وفد المملكة العربية السعودية.
Thank you, Saudi Arabia. Then I would like to give the floor very quickly to one observer, IEA, and then go back to TIAB and SAP. Very quickly. IEA.
Thank you, Co-Chair. The Environmental Investigation Agency would like to thank the Ozone Secretariat for the organisation of the meeting and the Government of Thailand and the people of Bangkok for their warm welcome. EIA also thanks the SAP and TEEP for their updated reports on emissions of HFC 23. As we have heard, these reached a record high of 17,300 tonnes in 2019, which is equivalent to emissions of more than 250 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. These are dangerous levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the midst of a climate crisis. Moreover, these emissions can be easily avoided through abatement technologies at relatively low cost. The efforts of the TEEP to link the emissions measured in the atmosphere to sources on the ground are being hampered by a lack of data, seemingly due to industry confidentiality and a plethora of monitoring and reporting problems. We are disappointed that no parties submitted information to assist the panels in making their assessments. What is clear is that we don't know exactly what is happening. We are lacking even basic data on fluoropolymer production that could enable the TEEP to make a comprehensive bottom-up emissions estimate. If we don't know what expected emissions are, how do we know the full extent of unexpected emissions, and how can we assess compliance? In our view, the situation underscores the critical need to generally improve monitoring, reporting and verification of Montreal Protocol controlled substances, as is being discussed under separate agenda items related to feedstocks, strengthening the institutions and atmospheric monitoring. We urge a strong response from the parties at this meeting, including a demand for transparency from producers, complete information from countries with fluoropolymer and HCFC 22 production, the establishment of clear guidelines for measuring, controlling and reporting HFC 23 emissions, the development of an auditing framework for fluoropolymer production, and additional efforts from all parties to eliminate, as a priority, the use of HFC 23 in all emissive applications. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you. I would like to propose that TEEP and SAP respond after we had the lunch break, so you have time to coordinate. I think it makes you quite happy. So that's one thing. And now I would like to give the floor to my co-chair to go to another agenda item very quickly.
Thank you. And very quickly to consider item 4D on very short-lived substances. At OEWG 46, the parties considered the response of their TEEP to Decision 35 on VSLS, prepared by the TEEP's MCTOC in cooperation with the SAP. Following the parties' initial discussions on the matter, Australia, Canada, the European Union, and Switzerland put forward a draft decision requesting the TEEP, in cooperation with the SAP, to provide additional information on VSLS. The draft decision was discussed in a contact group which revised the text but was unable to conclude its work. Parties agreed that they would resume discussions on this issue at MOP 36. The revised draft decision is set out in the draft decisions document 36.3 as draft decision 36A. And to be efficient, I would like to suggest that we establish a contact group right away and resume the discussions in the contact group. I will now open the floor to see if there are any delegates who have interventions to make in the plenary on this agenda item. Okay, I don't see anyone requesting for the floor. Thank you. And so we will establish the contact group. And may I suggest that Heidi from Germany and Yuan from Argentina to co-chair this contact group. With this, we will close the plenary for lunch. And like my co-chair just mentioned, we will continue with the SAP and TIPS responses in the afternoon. But before that, I would like to see if there is any announcement that the Secretariat would like to make. Okay, before Secretary takes the floor, I would also like to inform that, as announced earlier, the Budget Committee will have its first meeting from 1:45 to 2:45 at the Asia Pacific foyer on the ground floor, and the contact group on VSL will meet over the lunch break. And you can see the schedule for today also as well on the screen. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Distinguished delegates, the Secretariat would like to make the following announcements. Daily subsistence allowance will be paid to all sponsored delegates at the distribution counter next to the help desk. Please bring your passports and boarding passes from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Siam Commercial Bank is located at the first floor of the Secretariat building. It will be open from 8:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. Food and beverage stations located on level 1 are Coffee Corner, which will be open from 7 to 5 p.m., and the cafeteria from 6 to 8 a.m. and 11 to 3 p.m. Additional food and beverage stations are Rajapwek Lounge, located on the ground floor, and will be open from 7 to 5 p.m., and the One Tambon One Product, which will be open from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. The First Aid and Medical Services Center, located at the ground floor, will be open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. The prayer room is located on this floor, outside the plenary hall to your left. Greening our meetings. The Secretariat adopted its environmental management system in 2022, and this commits the Secretariat to upholding and improving the sustainability of its meetings. Distinguished delegates can support this initiative by bringing their own reusable water bottles and lanyards from previous meetings. More information on greening our meetings and travels can be found on the meeting portal. The Code of Conduct at UN meetings is applicable to all delegates at this meeting, and more information is also available from the meeting portal. The Secretariat would like to bring to the attention of the distinguished delegates of the Ozone Action Exhibition on what cools the air but warms the sky. It is at the ground floor next to the registration desk. Finally, the cocktail reception will be held on Thursday from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at the ground floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretariat, and we will resume the plenary at 3 p.m. See you everyone at 3 p.m. sharp. Have a good lunch.